sexy guys do. Explore what's all in their minds. Thinking about a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast for the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark, and I'm going to be your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, this week's topic is pretty seasonal in that lots of people are traveling for the holidays, which brings airlines to mind.
Yeah.
And one low-cost airline was in the news recently. Spirit Airlines recently declared bankruptcy, which struck me as kind of an irony because I can remember when air travel included frills like free meals and extra beverages and snacks and some nice things that I enjoyed back in the day. And then these budget airlines came along and removed all of that. And the thinking within the industry was this is how you make airline travel profitable for the business. But then Spirit, which is notorious for being an extremely low frills airline, declared bankruptcy, which makes it seem like the low-cost approach is also not profitable, which poses the question for me as an occasional air traveler, what does the future of air travel look like if it's neither amenities nor no amenities? And so, as I am wont to do, I set you off to look into that, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you discovered.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I agree, it's timely. I learned a lot in researching the answer to this question. And I know your question's about the future of air travel, but I think before we can talk sensibly about the future of air travel, we have to understand more about the past.
Mm-hmm.
So the answer to your question involves both a world historical event that took place in 2001, you could probably guess what that is,
mm-hmm.
and paradigm-changing legislation enacted in 1978 that you probably don't know much about.
Yeah.
I will eventually get to both, but I want to start with Spirit Airlines since you mentioned it in your question, and its current situation is symbolic of the dysfunctional status quo in air travel.
Okay.
As you referenced, on November 18th, Spirit Airlines filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, citing, among other things, increased competition, rising labor costs, and engine defects on some of its planes. Despite its no-frills business model, it had not been profitable since 2019. Its balance sheet $2.2 billion in the red since then, and its stock losing more than 90% of its value just this year. It suffered a further blow when a federal judge blocked its proposed merger with JetBlue Airways this past January. Over the summer, Spirit tried to revive its flagging business by adding premium services, with some tickets offering extra legroom, priority boarding status, and waived bag fees. The Chapter 11 filing means it can continue operating while restructuring its debt under court supervision. Spirit expects to emerge from bankruptcy in a few months, but every bankrupt company says that, so we'll see what happens.
Sure.
I read a couple of interesting things while researching the Spirit Airlines bankruptcy. The first is that its current incarnation as a budget airline started in 2006 when a private equity fund called Indigo Partners acquired a majority stake in the company. Under Indigo's stewardship, Spirit lowered its costs and started selling what the New York Times described as cheap, bare-bones tickets. As we discussed a few months ago in our episode about college athletics, slashing prices and services to boost profitability, regardless of its effects on people, is par for the course for private equity. That business model worked for Spirit, at least for a while, and as you mentioned in your question, it also became very influential in the industry as larger airlines started lowering their own fares and offering their own no-frills, basic economy tickets. It's also why Spirit faces federal antitrust litigation. The Justice Department cited the potential harm to consumers that would come from losing Spirit to a merger with JetBlue. It's possible that after emerging from bankruptcy, Spirit may try again to merge with another airline, especially since the incoming Trump administration can be expected to step back from vigorous antitrust enforcement, as it did the last time it was in office.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing I wanted to share is that there have been more than 180 airline bankruptcy filings in recent decades. In fact, 3 of America's 4 largest carriers, Delta, United, and American Airlines, filed for bankruptcy after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. But they all came back after merging with other airlines. 9/11 is significant in this story because the huge disruption that it caused served as the catalyst for major changes in the quality of air travel, none of them good. Almost nobody wanted to fly after planes were hijacked and weaponized by terrorists. The airlines received congressional subsidies and loan guarantees after 9/11, but they still lost about $7.7 billion from the cratering of demand. And those losses led to cuts in the number of flight attendants per flight and the shrinking and narrowing of seats to squeeze in extra seats and bolster revenue. Notwithstanding Spirit's problems, air travel is still a fast-growing industry. Here are some facts and figures for us to consider. Last year, worldwide airline passenger traffic was about 8.7 billion people. That number is expected to rise to 9.5 billion this year, a 10% increase, and 104% more than in 2019, just 5 years ago. Recent estimates suggest that demand will continue to increase by an average of 4.3% per year over the next 20 years. Every day, airplanes carry more than 10 million passengers. America's 19,000 public and private airports account for nearly 3 million of those passengers. Globally, aviation represents about 3.5% of GDP and is responsible for 65 million jobs. Flying is by far the safest mode of travel. The accident probability is literally 1 in a million. Despite being a major contributor to the greenhouse gases that cause climate change, it's still the only way to travel long distances quickly. And that's why it's growing despite all its economic problems. The consumer finance website Investopedia identified 4 reasons why the airline industry is in such a bad way. The first concerns the many costs involved in running an airline. Some are fixed but extremely high, like the leasing and loan repayment costs related to having a fleet of airplanes, or the payroll expenses for the large and unionized labor force that operates and services those planes. Other costs are anything but fixed, like the volatile price of oil to fuel the planes. Security costs have skyrocketed since 9/11. The second reason is that the airline industry is particularly vulnerable to external events like terrorism, natural disasters, and political instability, which exert a huge negative influence on demand. 9/11 was obviously a catastrophic blow to the industry, but even smaller events, like a volcanic eruption in Iceland in April 2010 that sent massive ash clouds over Europe and closed all European airports for a while, that caused collective losses of more than $2 billion. The third reason is most definitely self-inflicted: the airline industry's recent reputation for poor service. The list of passenger complaints keeps growing. Inconvenient schedules, long lines at check-in, high fees for checked bags, invasive security procedures, overbooked flights, surprise cancellations and delays, cramped seating, terrible in-flight food options, lost luggage. Have I missed anything, Mark?
No, that seems to be the suite of options that you have available today.
Yeah.
My most recent flight was in coach with a backache, so I experienced those things fairly acutely.
Yes, you and me both. In a world where the way you're perceived in mass culture is your reality, the perception so many of us share that air travel is a terrible ordeal makes it exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, for airlines to charge the higher prices required to make them profitable. Think about how many news reports or YouTube videos you've seen in recent years of passengers marooned in airports, or fist-fighting in the economy section, or gripes about lost luggage. Those are all PR disasters for the airline industry. The fourth reason offered by Investopedia is that unprofitable airlines often decide to stay in business despite their burgeoning costs and persistent losses, because shutting down means the loss of thousands of jobs, huge inconveniences for hundreds of thousands of travelers, and most importantly, millions of dollars in losses suffered by their creditors. It's the old sunk cost fallacy, where those in charge feel they can't afford to cease operations, so they continue to throw good money after bad. Industry consolidation, which is the euphemism for mergers, might offer a way out for some struggling airlines, and they happen from time to time. But as I pointed out with Spirit Airlines' attempt to merge with JetBlue, they also invite antitrust scrutiny. It's worth noting here that consolidation has its own adverse effects. Time magazine reported on the city of Cheyenne, Wyoming, which has a metro area of about 96,000 people. After Great Lakes Airlines declared bankruptcy in 2018, Cheyenne joined dozens of other small American cities that lost commercial air service. To replace that service, a consortium of philanthropists, local businesses, and government officials raised more than $2 million per year to pay SkyWest Airline to keep running the only commercial flights into and out of the Cheyenne airport. According to one of the locals involved in this effort, the only way to convince an airline to serve a place like Cheyenne is to pledge what's known as minimum revenue guarantees to offset potential losses if the route itself doesn't make money, which it doesn't. This anecdote reflects a much larger trend in which places like Cheyenne lose air service if they don't produce the ransom money so that, as Time put it, quote, multi-billion-dollar airlines will deign to serve their relatively smaller communities, end quote. This trend has only grown since the pandemic, with the 4 largest U.S. airlines pulling out of 68 cities since April 2020, and some communities using their COVID relief funds to pay airlines for continued service. It's an existential issue for the affected cities and regions, because even in an era of hybrid and remote work, when you can't easily get someplace, quote, companies don't want to locate there, people don't want to move there, and tourists don't want to visit, end quote.
Yeah.
And that brings us to what I believe is the chief villain in our story, airline deregulation, which started in 1978. Before then, airlines were regulated by an agency called the Civil Aeronautics Board, or CAB, that dictated not only where they flew, but also what they could charge. This ensured that smaller cities were connected to larger ones by air. Even if those routes were money losers, the airlines would recoup the loss with the CAB's higher pricing on the more profitable routes between big cities.
Yeah.
That's a pricing strategy known as cross-subsidization, where a company, or in this case the government, sets higher prices for one group of consumers to subsidize lower prices for another group.
Yeah, as you're taking me through this, it strikes me that imagine if the nation's interstate system had been privatized. where the only roads that were being built were the ones that were profitable for the businesses that were building those roads. And so you would have highways connecting major urban districts, but you would have no roads, no paved roads at all going to smaller cities.
Yes.
And what a profound economic and also cultural impact that would have had on the development of the country. And so it's two paths that we took. By way of the automobile, the government decided that it was going to make sure you could pretty much get anywhere you wanted to. Whereas by way of privatization, we've decided to hand that over to airlines to decide where you can fly.
Yes, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but I'm glad you pointed out the roads because there's a critique of deregulation that I'm going to get into in detail shortly. And one of the things I was not planning to present was that they applied that exact logic of deregulation to the roads and ended up exactly where you did, with a lot of providers, cutthroat competition to build a lot of straight roads between major metropolitan areas and turnpikes where they're getting fees for those roads. Mm-hmm. And then there being no secondary and tertiary roads into the more far-flung regions or the exurbs or rural areas because there's no money in that.
Right.
So, yeah.
The libertarian dream is to hand over maintenance of roads and bridges to private companies, and that would be the outcome.
Right. Without cross-subsidization, many shorter and less popular routes will simply never be profitable. Nonetheless, in 1978, Congress deregulated modes of travel including airlines, trucking, intercity buses, and railroads under the theory that doing so would increase competition and lead to lower prices for consumers. The text of the Airline Deregulation Act argued that unleashing quote-unquote competitive market forces in air travel would both expand consumer choices and spur, quote, efficiency, innovation, and low prices, end quote. While it's true that deregulation brought lower fares and budget airlines, its positive effects were temporary, while the long-term costs were enormous in practically every other way. Philip Longman and Lena Khan wrote a provocative analysis and takedown of airline deregulation in the Washington Monthly in 2012. Lena Khan is today the head of the FTC, who spearheaded the government's antitrust opposition to the Spirit JetBlue merger. The Washington Monthly piece is comprehensive and persuasive. Mark, I'm going to post it as the first source for this episode on our Facebook page, and I encourage you and our listeners to read it in full. But here are a few key points. Let's take the cross-subsidization I just mentioned. Pre-deregulation, the federal government treated airlines the way they treat the post office, as a public necessity. In the case of the post office, quote, the founders understood that private enterprise could not by itself provide broadly distributed postal service because of the high cost of delivering mail to smaller towns and far-flung cities. And so they wrote into the Constitution that a government monopoly would take on the challenge, providing the necessary cross-subsidization, end quote. Whereas after deregulation, the financiers and boards of directors of private airlines to whom the control and pricing of air travel was turned over cared little about cross-subsidization or taking the longer view about connectivity and whether it was in the best interests of the country for places like Cheyenne, Wyoming to be reachable by air. But this problem is far bigger than Cheyenne. Even large heartland cities like Cincinnati, St. Louis, Memphis, and Pittsburgh now suffer from inadequate air service, forcing major global companies like Chiquita Brands to leave Cincinnati for the air hub of Charlotte, North Carolina, because they could no longer attract talent to a place like Cincinnati that required a long, expensive connecting flight to an airport whose flight volume had fallen by 2/3 since 2004. Longman and Kahn warned that the continued frantic pace of mergers and downsizing was only going to make things worse. Quote, going forward, all industry forecasts call for further consolidation and continually rising fares and fees, accompanied by declining service on all but the most heavily trafficked routes." End quote. They've been right so far. In 2022 alone, prices went up by 25%, the biggest jump since the feds began tracking this data in 1989. Since 2002, the money the airlines make per passenger mile is up 84%. And despite all that price gouging, the airline industry writ large has lost more than $13 billion since deregulation. Carriers raise fares and cut routes, and they still can't make a profit or even cover their costs. Deregulation is failing almost everyone: shareholders, airline employees, the business community, and certainly the public. It works only for the swells who fly first class and the private equity financiers and consultants plotting all those mergers.
With minds like steel traps, more than joy here to discern. The interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. And it's a calling and they do it for you. Explain me, baby. Explain. It's a calling that you don't do it too.
Longman and Kahn cite the cautionary tale of U.S. railroad history, which was unregulated in its early years and experienced many of the same problems that plague the airline industry today, from unprofitable routes to ruinous competition to bankrupt providers to mass consolidation to local inequalities. Those problems led to the creation of the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887, a central regulatory body that helped put the railroad industry on more solid footing via cross-subsidization and other techniques. In Longman and Kahn's telling, it was, quote, "messy and far from flawless, but railroads were regulated as natural monopolies that would be allowed to remain in private hands and earn a profit, but not at the cost of skewing the overall efficiency, balance, and fairness of the American economy." End quote. In other words, regulation worked. The same thinking applied to air travel beginning in the 1930s. The CAB promoted what it called the public right of transit, with hard-earned knowledge from the railroad example that, quote, "unregulated competition would be unable to provide it," end quote. The system performed well into the 1970s, with innovation flourishing, prices gradually falling, and customer satisfaction high. But around the time of Jimmy Carter's presidency, the combination of high inflation, which governing liberals were anxious to avoid, and doesn't that sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
The ascendant consumer rights movement with its mantra of lower prices and fury at the sclerotic regulatory state, the success of Southwest Airlines, the first discount carrier, which escaped regulation by the CAB by flying only within Texas, and the growing influence of neoliberal thinking, which ultimately led to Ronald Reagan's victory in 1980. All those things pushed even liberal lions like Ted Kennedy into voting for deregulation. The fateful decision to deregulate air travel hasn't aged well, with many legislators coming to regret their votes and airline experts claiming that deregulation led to the worst of both worlds, a survival of the fittest industry with many fewer airlines, all trying desperately to drive each other out of business, yet moving in lockstep on rising prices and declining service. Deregulation caused a massive wave of bankruptcies in the 1980s, followed by consolidation in the 1990s, and again during the Great Recession between 2007 and 2012. Today, just 4 airlines control 80% of the U.S. market. and the global airline industry is more concentrated than it's been since the dawn of flight. Meanwhile, since 1978, virtually every new startup, like People Express, which I mentioned at the end of our last episode, has either gone out of business or been absorbed by one of the behemoths, leaving only JetBlue and Southwest still competitive nationally. Deregulation's central promise of allowing plenty of new airlines to compete in the marketplace proved illusory. Before Breeze Airlines started operations in 2021, the industry had gone 14 years without a new entrant. Now that's a whole lot of pain I just detailed. But if you're still not sold on deregulation being a bad idea, consider these additional factors. Before deregulation, airlines were required to honor each other's tickets. So if your flight was canceled, you could easily move to another. Air routes and ticket prices were more predictable, so you could buy a ticket months before traveling and be reasonably sure the airline wouldn't cancel the flight, change the route, or go out of business in the interim. Today, if you're flying to a smaller destination and suffer a long layover before getting there, you can thank deregulation for that. As I mentioned in the story about Cheyenne, Wyoming, the minute carriers were no longer required to fly directly to and from certain cities, they pulled out of unprofitable routes and developed the so-called hub and spoke model we have today, with fewer direct flights. From a bureaucracy perspective, deregulation dramatically increased the role of the chronically underfunded and understaffed FAA, which has led to a spiraling delays and cancellations in recent years. It's easy for the free market fetishists, safely ensconced in their plush Wall Street offices or DC boardrooms, to argue that airlines should remain unshackled by regulation and not forced to fly unprofitable routes. The fact is that when our government stopped treating air travel as a public good, it left the fate of small communities to the whims of that free market. As we know in every other context, when the private sector alone is left to decide, it decides to do only what makes money. And in the case of air travel, that means servicing lots of routes on the two coasts and not so many in between. The law professor Morgan Ricks and two colleagues at Vanderbilt published a paper arguing that between 1930 and 1980, the regulatory regimes of the Progressive and New Deal eras helped make the regions of our country more economically equal. But the deregulatory wave in transportation reversed that progress by increasing geographic inequality. Ricks told Time magazine, quote, "Where the rural states start to really fall behind coincides with this moment in the 70s and 80s that we abandoned a set of principles about broad-based access to infrastructure resources." End quote. Of course, airline deregulation is but one of many causes for the rampant inequality we have now, but there's no doubt that a decline in airline service is tied to the declining fortunes in many struggling cities and regions. Longman and Kahn concluded their piece with an argument for re-regulating air travel. Quote, "Airlines, just like railroads, waterworks, electrical utilities, and most other networked systems, require concentration both to achieve economies of scale and to enable the cross-subsidization between low and high-cost service necessary to preserve their value as networks. And when it comes to such natural monopolies that are essential to the public, there is no equitable or efficient alternative to having the government regulate or coordinate entry, prices, and service levels, no matter how messy the process may be." End quote. They argued that our generation had to relearn the lesson that previous generations learned from railroads. To do so required liberating ourselves from what they called the false prophets of deregulation. I agree, Though with those false prophets soon to be ascendant again in Washington, I would counsel against holding your breath.
There's one part of this that I'm not understanding. I'm not seeing how re-regulation is going to change the economics in such a way that airlines are not going to be running into bankruptcy periodically. I don't see how requiring them to serve lower trafficked hubs would improve their economic situation. It seems like it might make it worse.
I think what they're arguing is that you would force the airlines to serve lower traffic places, and then the prices are going to go up in order for airlines to retain profitability. We had regulation and the airlines were profitable and prices were manageable and everybody seemed happy. And then they deregulated. And by the way, the leaders of all the airlines argued vociferously against deregulation, and they lost that argument. A return to regulation would establish the conditions that existed before 1978, where there was a huge regulatory state, but the industry was healthier.
Okay. So basically the idea is that the industry is driving itself towards bankruptcy by ruthlessly competing with each other on prices.
Correct.
And re-regulation would mandate that prices be set at a more sustainable level, which ultimately would hit consumers. It's like it would make it more expensive for me to fly to Chicago, for instance.
Yes, correct.
But the industry as a whole would be in a better condition.
Correct. And all things considered, I think you'd be happy with paying that higher rate if your experience was markedly better than it is today.
Yeah, there is that insult added to injury bit of the experience in coach is so miserable, and yet I'm also paying $1,000 for 2 round trip tickets to Chicago.
Yes. So I don't know what the price point would be in a re-regulated regime, but I think the assumption is that the experience will be better and ultimately you will accept the higher price point and welcome the change. Now, lest you think this argument for re-regulation is just a partisan talking point, the argument against deregulation is not the sole province of liberals like Lena Khan. Bob Crandall, the former president and CEO of American Airlines in the 1980s and 90s, and a legend in the airline industry who, among other things, invented the frequent flyer program, said in a speech in 2008 that he considered commercial aviation deregulation a huge failure and that it was time to bring back government oversight. Quote, "It's time to acknowledge that airlines are more like utilities than ordinary businesses. We have failed to confront the reality that unfettered competition just doesn't work very well in certain industries." End quote. Like Lena Khan, Crandall proposed re-regulating the industry by restoring the government's role in pricing, prohibiting new carriers from offering below-cost fares that are unprofitable for everyone, making it harder for unions to strike, pressuring carriers to use only larger jets and offer fewer flights per day, and replacing our antiquated air traffic control system with something more efficient. Crandall's proposals are far from progressive and not a dream scenario for passengers who would have fewer options and higher fares, or for employees who already suffered steep cuts to their wages and benefits and would have even less flexibility in their ongoing collective bargaining. But the potential upsides of re-regulation are not insignificant. The government-imposed discipline of scheduled streamlining would reduce bottlenecks at big airports. The higher fares would at least be more consistently applied, and the financial stability they bring to airlines might lead to improvements like better customer service, newer, cleaner planes, and more and better food on long-haul flights. So, Mark, to the ultimate question of how will this affect me, the answer is that, absent some significant change to the failing business model, like, say, re-regulation, the vast majority of flyers who travel economy class can expect more of the same in the way of all the miserable trends they're now experiencing, meaning more tack-on nuisance fees, less legroom, longer lines, and less service. Meanwhile, airlines will continue responding to their existential crisis by merging and cutting capacity. I didn't see anything in my research about your nightmare scenario of standing room only sections on flights. But if there's a way to further reduce legroom and overall comfort, I'm sure they'll find it. And then someday, probably after we're dead, when the free market fever breaks and politicians finally own up to the grave error they made in 1978, we'll find our way back to re-regulating air travel and things will gradually get better.
Mm-hmm.
That is, unless all the exciting technologies of the future save us, which is a tease for a special value-added episode of Mansplaining that we're going to have after wrapping up this episode. So be on the lookout for that.
Exciting. Well, I have to say that seems like the near-term dystopia where airline travel is kind of miserable for those of us who can't afford first-class travel.
Yeah.
And it's likely to get worse before it gets better, and hopefully someday it will get better, but maybe we're just headed off to a deregulation nightmare where there's 2 airlines and they only serve 5 cities and every ticket costs $10,000 and still they're going bankrupt.
Yeah, right now it seems clear to me it's a race to the bottom. At the end, I mentioned something about below cost flights. Like budget airlines start, and of course they want to establish themselves in the market, but they offer below cost flights, which literally means they can't break even with the prices they're charging. So that sends all the other airlines scurrying to offer their own discount fares, often below cost, and none of them are making any money. So, and it's just a race to the bottom and a survival of the fittest mentality where they're keeping prices artificially low to knock each other out of business. And really nobody is being served by that. If you think you're being served by paying a cheap fare for your basic economy seat in that misery-laden experience of traveling that I outlined, then you're fooling yourself. It's about more than the price. It's about the experience.
Yeah. And that experience used to be so much better.
Yes.
The very first flight I took was to Chicago about 40 years ago.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed it. The meal wasn't amazing, but it was edible.
Right.
And you got a full can of Coke and another one if you wanted it. And they had the honey roasted peanuts. I remember back in the day, you were a big fan of the honey roasted peanuts.
Yeah.
And the seats were not so crammed together that you felt like you were sitting on top of each other. And it's just gotten worse and worse and worse since then.
Yeah.
That I take part in as little as possible. And can you think of another industry where the customers hate the experience and do it as little as possible? There aren't many industries that can survive long-term that way. And it just does seem like everything is circling the drain.
Yeah. You mentioned how the airline meal wasn't perfect, but it was edible. I would say it was served, even more basic than whether it's edible or not. They served a real meal. Now they don't do that anymore. The decline in air service was very gradual. When I first flew, that would be the fall of 1981. It's only 3 years after deregulation. It took a decade or longer for things to really start to deteriorate. And then 9/11 was a shattering thing for the airline industry, and things really got worse after that.
Well, thank you for that. I do look forward to hearing the bonus content. So I will stay tuned for that. I hope our listeners will as well. That was not a hopeful presentation, at least not yet, but it was definitely an informative one that puts my experience in a context that makes it understandable.
Yeah, and I will say the bonus content is definitely more hopeful. It looks back and looks forward, and both of those stories are happier than the one I just told. So for those of you who are really grasping for the straight razor right now, please hang in there and listen to the other part of this episode. So
yeah, yes, please, no suicides between now and the next part.
Right. Or at least if you do go through with it, don't list mansplaining in your note as the reason.
No.
Don't list this episode.
Yeah, you can reference a podcast if you need to, but don't name us by name. We don't need that kind of trouble.
Right. So I have a question for you.
Looking forward to it.
So our next taping is scheduled for December 20th. And I want to continue the tradition of holiday-themed episodes that we've developed since we started this podcast in 2020. In prior years, we talked about topics like the history of the Christmas and New Year's holidays, things that are going right in the world, and what we're thankful for. This year, just a month after another fractious election in which the country seems more polarized than ever, I want us to seriously consider how we might heal the divide and bring peace to our nation. Is that even possible? As we did in our thankfulness episode, I might chip in one or two thoughts about this topic after hearing yours. What do you think?
Okay. Well, that's certainly a big topic. I don't even know where to start with it, but it'll be a meaty one. And so look forward to seeing where that one leads me.
Yeah, and peace is certainly a holiday-themed topic. So I thought if we're ever going to talk about this kind of thing, maybe this is the time to do it.
Yeah. Well, this is indeed the time to think of peace, and it's also the time to bring a close to this particular episode of Mansplaining. Thank you for spending your time with us. That was Joe, and I'm Mark, and we'll see you next time.
Talk to you next time.
Paid extra for legroom, got stuck by the bathroom. The Wi-Fi's not working, the flight crew is lurking, with card after card of snacks a la carte. Get me out of this plane. I've had quite enough of this sardine can stuff. It's driving me insane. They lost all my bags. Now all that I have is my carry-on pride and this bumpy ride, while babies cry and my patience dies. Get me out of this plane. I've had quite enough of this sardine can stuff. It's driving me insane. Here's the situation for airline execs. It's deregulation or customer castration. For me, it's defenestration followed by flotation.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.
Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us, because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now, and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really.